Hello and welcome to Old and New Turkey with Gökhan Bacık. Gökhan, welcome.
Hello, Yavuz.
Evet, Gökhan is joining us from Czechia and he's a university professor there. And this is the second in the series of our talks about Turkey, Islam, political system, all of these issues that create a lot of interest and curiosity, because it's quite a puzzle. So this time, let's talk about Islamic groups and Turkish state, which has always been an issue, a phenomenon. How can we explain the historical patterns of relations between state and various Islamic groups, sects, etc. in Turkey?
Yeah, as you said, it's always a popular topic, especially in Turkish studies. Well, historically speaking, Yavuz, we can talk about some patterns because what we call Turkish state tradition is more or less the same since, say, 13th century. So it includes the Selçuklu period, Ottoman period, and Turkish Republic, including both Kemalist and the post-Kemalist Islamist periods. And we can also detect the same pattern in terms of state and Islam. Mm-hmm. So the first pattern, I should say that Islam always serves state. So in the Turkish system, raison d'etat is always above Islam, which
when
means...
When you say always, you're talking about a very vast historic perspective.
That's right, yeah. There are some...
into the early Ottomans, or...
No. Well, there are some exceptional periods, but I would say the whole period since the Selçuk, Anatolian Selçukis, the Rome Selçukis, which means a cooperation between state and religion, but with the condition of supremacy of state. So they cooperate, but in terms of crisis, it is the power elites that dictates the rules of the game. This creates some other important consequences. One of them is Islam is always an ideology of justification in Turkey. It's never been a theory of opposition, for example. In the Selçukis, I don't say that they always lost their autonomy against it, but usually as a principle, the Sunni Islam in the Turkish context is a state-oriented paradigm. So it's never been a kind of dynamic to put some check and balance in the system. The second is Turkish state is happy to cooperate with Islamic groups, which brings us to the point your question emphasized. In this regard, again, looking this long period, I detect three major, let's say, model. The first is the Nakshi groups. In that regard, I would say Turkey historically is a Nakshi land. Nakshistan, that's right, Naqshbandiya. This is created mostly by several guys such as Gujduvani and Naqshbandi who lived between 12th and 14th century, which was updated in 16th century by Sirhindi, which is popularly known in the region as Rabbani, because Rabbani was such critical, he brought the Islamic orders close to politics. And to a large extent, in Turkey, in the late Ottoman period, Ziyaettin Gümüşhane, who was the leading name of Naqshbandi order, inspired by Rabbani. So this is the first group. In Istanbul, that's right. And there were some serious rumors that even Ottoman ruler interested in Naqshbandi at that time. And inspired by Rabbani, after the 1838 Anglo-Ottoman trade agreement, which opened Ottoman Empire to global capitalism, the first time we see Naqshbandis protesting publicly the state, which is very unusual. The second group is the Qadri order, which was initiated by Gilani, or popularly known Geylani, who lived in Selçuklu Iran, the region Gilan. His names come from there. Interestingly, even it is a Sufi order, it connects itself to Prophet, not through Abu Bakr but Ali. This is also important because in the Kurdish areas, so there are some Qadri groups. For example, a small group which is known with Haydarbash is a Qadri. So it's quite important because
Haydarbash was a leader of a political party as well.
Right.
So
yeah.
we should give some sort of end notes to our viewers about who he is and etc. Right. So okay.
So this is the second. I may say competing, okay, because Naqshbandiya connects itself with Prophet through Abu Bakr. It's a typical Sunni state-oriented. That's why when you this is important. For instance, in the case of Haydarbash, you see, which is a role model. I mean, a typical model, a different understanding about Iran, for example, because during during Selçukis, for instance, when Fatimids was great threat, or later during Ottomans when Iran was a threat, those orders play key roles because it was not only a political fight with Iran, it was also ideological fight, as the case today. So we have the Naqshi groups, the Qadri groups, and the third is which are organized not in the form of traditional orders, but what we call social movement. And among them, the famous is the Nurcu movement. So they're not organized like orders. They don't call themselves orders. But I think to a large extent, in terms of those patterns, they are also state-friendly. They are happy to cooperate with state. So another principle, maybe finally, if state believes that, so state is always happy to see these tarikats, orders, or movements in the game, but if any of them gets too much leverage, goes beyond the red line, they purge that movement. So we have this in 16th century, during late Ottoman Empire, second Mahmud, and also in my understanding, the recent fight between AKP and Gülen movement was another case. So state is happy to, let's say, employ those people in domestic politics, in foreign policy, okay, in some ideological competition in the case of soft power. But when a group becomes such influential so far as to challenge the power elites, immediately state purges that movement. So that game, which tolerates Islamic movements, never let them to become the main player in the game.
Mm-hmm. But end of Ottoman Empire, and also coming of the Party of Progress and Union, İttihat Terakki, the relationships in the post-İttihat Terakki period, post-First World War period, coming of Mustafa Kemal and then establishment of Republic, I think that poses a break point, I think, in these orders' relations, Islamic groups' relations with the power.
Yeah.
And that is also important in understanding.
True. Well, yes, because that's true, because in late 20s and early 30s, with a new regulation, religious orders were declared illegal. However, on the one hand, it doesn't mean that the state tradition gives up its historical pattern cooperating with state. In this case, we have Directorate of Religious Affairs, which Kemalism put into the system. So Sharia is now within the official system, even though it's not part of the law, but Diyanet is teaching Sharia, okay, so and so forth. So this is one. The second point is Kemalism, even its golden period, has limited capacity to penetrate periphery. So in most of Anatolia, especially in the eastern, in the case of the official madrasa, the eastern religious schools, so they survived, because you should imagine 1930s and even 40s when it was the, if I may say, golden age of Kemalism. But Kemalism, to a large extent, was very strong in urban areas. So in the rest of Turkey, they survived. The third point is, even in the western part of Turkey, they developed a kind of adaptation strategies, in a kind of survival mentality. So I accept that. I mean, that is why most of the religious orders and Islamic movements are very skeptical about Atatürk and Kemalism, because for them it was a very tough period for their survival. But it doesn't mean that Kemalism was able to suspend or cancel all their activities.
Mm-hmm. And also an additional element is whether or not any of these orders in Republican Turkey have had any ties, links, cooperations with Ikhwan, with Muslim Brotherhood, whose emergence was, I think, 1920s, 30s, etc. In Middle East and in Egypt, etc. Is that an element to take it into account?
Very, very important point. In my reading, the authentic Ottoman Islamism late 19th century, and to a large extent, early Republican Islamism had no connection with some sort of, actually there was no Ikhwan. But two things change these dynamics. The first is, especially after 1950s, there's a new wave of translation from Arabic.
But before 1950s, why was there no connection?
There was, and there was no connection because, I mean, actually, and among Nurcu movement, there were some guys such as Salih Özcan, who first initiated translations of these Islamists into Turkish. So there was a that's right. So there was a time when Turkish. So then we should classify classical Turkish Islamism, okay, and the new Islamism, which we can explain as more close to, or having some sort of close relations with the Islamism as we know in Egypt. Then, especially in the 70s, 80s, it was the, I should say again, the golden age of the impact of Arab Islamism onto Turkish. And to a large extent today, Turkish Islamism is now has now a lot of similarities. But if you go back to late 19th century, early 20th century, no, it was a kind of Ottoman Islamism which emerged as a reaction to the grand question, what went wrong in Turkey? Because Ottoman Empire was, underdeveloped society. Those intellectuals such as Abdul Efgani came to Istanbul, invited by Sultan, a great reformist, and Ali Pasha, a grand reformist of the age, want him to steer Ottoman ulema. And there were some other guys such as Rifat Tahtavi, who was the former rector of Azhar University in in 1800s, and even for a while there was Egypt under occupation. He left Egypt and spent some time in Ottoman cities such as Istanbul. So in the beginning, Islamism in the Turkish context was an Ottoman idea, and probably there was such as Turkism, modernism. So it was one response of Ottoman intellectuals like modernism, which Atatürk followed later. But it was after, it's difficult to give an exact date, but probably it's 50s and 60s now. We easily detect very strong similarities between Ikhwan and Turkish Islamism, mostly because of translations from Arabic.
Mm-hmm. Then we saw it's the Cold War, of course. Turkey is, staunch part of the Cold War construction, and then also the emergence of various political parties from 1950s and some form of clientelism. We have seen always there with center-right and right parties, and this seems to have created a lot of new patterns, which brings us to today's present Turkey, and strengthening of, I think, offshoot of Nurcu's Gülen movement, and on the other hand, the Milli Görüş, the national view, represented strongly by Necmettin Erbakan, predecessor of the AKP, Welfare Party, etc. So bring us up to date to present Turkey in the light of these movements, so that we can understand better the current relations.
Yeah, to a large extent, I agree. Some typical groups like the Nurcu movement during the Cold War period were followers of center-right parties such as Menderes Democrat Party and later Justice Party of Demirel. But the point is, one of these groups, which is Iskender Pasha, which was at the time followers of that late Ottoman Sheikh Ziyaüddin, who was represented by Mehmet Zahid Kotku, a guy who came from Caucasia, who was replaced by Esat Chushan. So they became the center of the first time political Islam activism, and that system created what we know National Salvation Party.
We are talking about 1970s.
1969, 60s, yeah, 69. Even well before National Salvation Party, there was the I forget the name with the first Islamist party. Anyway, that we know with affiliated to Erbakan. So there are many groups, and most of them kept supporting center-right parties, mainly Nurcu movement, because they felt that Islamist party may risk their stakes against authoritarian Kemalism. It was a tactical step. But as I said, among them, the Iskender Pasha group, which was led by Esat Coşan, became the center of political activism from which we have the tradition. And it is not wrong to address that also as an origin which created Tayyip Erdogan as a kind of, let's say, offshot. Maybe not very much linked to that, because interestingly, Erdogan, even he had close connections with such organization, has been a kind of independent actor. So Erdogan has always been part of that network, but skeptical of these orders, which is critical to understand his relations with other organizations. But there's an interesting point. In 80s, in late 70s and early 80s, there was a clash between Esat Coşan, the Sheikh of Naqshbandi, and Erbakan over who will be the main guy. It was just like the fight between Christian Democrat parties and the church. And there's famous Kalivas has a fantastic book on that fight. Very much similar happened in Turkey. And part of that fight, Erbakan declared that as the party who relies on popular support, then it was the split. And for a while, Esat Coşan even supported Özal's motherland party. So now we have a party which gained its autonomy from Islamic orders, the welfare party. But with Erdogan, we have much more changes. First of all, Erdogan probably was the first guy who was able to unite all groups.
Up until Erdogan, we should also shed some light over how far the, shall we use the word penetration into the state structures, which was mainly dominated by Republican Kemalist elite, let's say, and subgroup maybe Freemasons, small, but Demirel was a Freemason, for example, and 50s and 60s Freemasons were quite influential in the state structure, security structures, etc., etc. How, as before, just before Erdogan took over, how was the sort of the penetration into the state structures of these?
Yeah, first of all, during the Cold War period, even it was not declared, there was a quite strong relation between state and Islamic groups, part of anti-communism, and Nurcu groups, some other Islamic groups. And quite interestingly, in 1980, after military coup, the junta, which took over Turkey in the name of Kemalism, opened the gates to Naqshbandi. Then we have Özal, the first Naqshbandi politician, then become the president, and we have Bozkurt Özal, his brother, and other guys. So many famous names we know, such as Cemil Çiçek, Abdülkadir Aksu, I mean, who have some kind of relations with Naqshbandi order. So on the one hand, 1980 was a military coup, but on the other hand, it was the first time that the Naqshbandi order put its stamp on Turkish bureaucracy. For example, so in this regard, the political regime after 1980 coup was a strange mixture of Kemalist soldiers, nationalist Kemalist soldiers, and the Naqshbandi. But it was not surprising, given that they were in alliance against communism during Cold War period. For example, Gülen was member of anti-communist organizations when he was young in Erzurum. So there is nothing surprising. But again, within the control of that game where state is the final arbiter. So you can, I mean, you are welcome as long as you accept state, let's say, the supremacy of state. But with Erdogan, things change, because before Erdogan, more or less, each Islamic organization was autonomous. So they have differences over politics. But it's been with Erdogan, because Erdogan dominated the state mechanism. Then, especially after 2005 and 2006, Erdogan openly demands all Islamic groups to subjugate him, okay, subjugate. Then we have some sort of new patterns. First of all, there are some groups which are in, I may say, perfect harmony, such as the Naqshbandi, but the Adıyaman group, which dominates Ministry of Health. And even to counterbalance their dominance, Erdogan appoint a minister, the incumbent one, from Iskender Pasha origin. So this is a ministry dominated with Adıyaman group, but led by a minister from Iskender Pasha. Or Speaker of Turkish Parliament is coming from Iskender Pasha as well.
The Department of Finance. We know that Turgut Özal's elder brother was with many other people.
That's right. What you mean in terms of what? I mean, in terms of bureaucracy, very influential. Because the point is, as of mid 2000, there was a new demographic balance of Turkish bureaucracy. Only a few institutions such as Central Bank, Ministry of Foreign Affairs left to Kemalists. Most of others occupied by Anatolian origin guys. The reason is it was not economically good idea to work for state. I mean, for example, why a graduate of Boğaziçi University should work for Ministry of Agriculture? It was not like 30s, 20s, when it was very prestigious for seculars. Or why a brilliant upper middle class family guy work for Ministry of Education? I mean, just compare the salaries. That makes demographically conservatives dominant over Kemalists in terms of competition. Then we have large group of people from conservative areas, from Maraş, other areas to dominate, and part of the recruitment policy of Islamic orders. Then Erdogan emerged here. So then Erdogan is in a position to orchestrate. So Erdogan is the president of, the head of state, chairman of AKP, but also orchestrating those Islamic groups. There are some groups who are skeptical to that, but because they have some fears, they are silent. One of them is Süleymancı group or Süleymanlı group, another gigantic body which origins trace back to 1930s, created by Süleyman Tunahan. But they are skeptical, and historically they have had relations with center parties, late, Demirel, but they don't want to, let's say, threaten Erdogan. But the rest, and even there is a historical change after Gülen, the collapse of Gülen movement in Turkey. Nurcu groups, which are historically critical to Islamic parties, are now very much close to Erdogan. The only exception is Yeni Asya group, a small group, which is still stick to Democrat Party tradition, critical of Erdogan, running Yeni Asya newspaper. But probably all others, and Erdogan, many people don't know it. If you go in detail, for instance, Erdogan frequently has phone calls with leaders of these groups. So he creates the idea among these Islamic groups. Even Erdogan has problems in terms of corruption, in terms of economy. He represents Islam, so we should defend him. Otherwise, we will have Kemalists back, because Erdogan is distributing a lot of opportunities to them. I mean, now in the last 10 years, they opened their universities, their hospitals, and because of this alliance, they are virtually not subject to any state control. So they are just state within state. So, and also there are some groups, as I told, normally skeptical of Erdogan, but Erdogan, they don't want to clash with Erdogan. Particularly, the memory of what happened to Gülen movement is a very disciplining project. And maybe I should name Erenköy, which is probably the flash organizations, and who have the former Eymen Topbaş, once the head of Anavatan, Özal's motherland party, Istanbul branch, but they now close to AKP. And among them, there are some people who are the member of billionaire clubs, Topbaş family, and they dominate Diyanet in these days, for example. And if I am asked, I will say that it is Firmus Inter Pares in Turkey, very, very much close to Erdogan, and there are a lot of opportunities. So
what is the name of this group again?
Erenköy, led by Osman Nuri Topbaş, which was it was also Nakşibendi, Mahmut Sami Ramazanoğlu years ago. But the interesting point, Ramazanoğlu was a man who was socialized both in Nakşi and Kadiri origin. So they are the flash groups. I should say that it was like Iskender Pasha in the early period of welfare party. So they dominate, and they are very loyalist right now. And also Işıkçılar, who owns Türkiye Gazete newspaper and TV channels. Işıkçılar is also is a very interesting phenomenon because
Nakşi group too.
Yeah, Nakşi group, but interestingly they follow Arvasi, Abdülhakim Arvasi, who come from, and who was replaced by Hüseyin Hilmi Işık, who was an army officer, and his son-in-law, Enver Ören, late Enver Ören, was also a colonel in the army. So in the Turkish case, we have a religious group who was mostly formed and led by army officers, okay? And even Enver Ören for a while spent some time in Italy, part of NATO scholarship. So it's very complicated. Then we have very complicated. So it's just so virtually two army officers shaped an Islamic movement in Turkey, and they are very aggressive defender of Turkish Islamic synthesis. And more interestingly, if you look from a different perspective, sometimes they also reflect the inner balances within AKP. For example, some of them are close to Soylu. Then they are a bit critical. Okay, so
Soylu meaning Minister of Interior.
That's right. Then the way, for example, Işıkçılar is positioned is not like Erenköy today, because even though in general they are supporters of Erdogan, if you go in detail, there are differences. Okay, in terms because there are some guys beyond Erdogan within AKP, such as Soylu, such as other guys. So Erdogan is successful in becoming the guy who orchestrates. By the way, I don't say that Islamic groups are very influential in elections. Their followers, I don't think they have so many followers to change the electoral results. But for two reasons, they are important. First, they are human resources for any Islamic movement in Turkey. The second point is they have a huge capacity to legitimize Erdogan among Islamic circles. Then they keep, but this is again not specific to Erdogan. As I told, what I'm telling is again the historical pattern: Islamic groups serving to Erdogan.
Yes, I think you didn't mention the emergence, rise of Gülen movement, because a lot of analysis is made on this entry into the stage of the state structure. Where do we place them, and how dominant or prominent were they?
Well, Gülen movement actually was originally part of the Nurcu movement. Then Gülen declared, if I may say, independence from Nurcu movement. So it's so
a breakout group.
That's right, Nurcu movement, and because it happened in Izmir for a while among Islamic actors, it's called Izmir Group. Before it was named as Gülen Group. Because of the Nurcu origin, Gülen is known for its extreme skepticism to Islamism. And historically speaking, Nurcu Group is the group which is known its deep intellectual skepticism. It's mainly the discussion. Islamism believes that Islam should rule Turkey by political instruments, while Nurcu says that it should be a social project through mainly bureaucracy, okay, so and so forth. And this skepticism survived till 2003 and 4. And even, I don't know, I mean, this is a very important question. What happened and how Gülen was convinced to cooperate with AKP? Because I remember Gülen staying very critical, skeptical to Erdogan, even in the early period of AKP rule.
Until you said 2004.
That's right. So it's a I don't want to use the mystery, but this is something unknown. It must be analyzed in detail. What happened and that movement, which is skeptical Erdogan, because historically those guys never liked each other, but suddenly we have the AKP Gülen coalition. It could be because of the secular threat. It could be because of a change in ideology. But then, as of 2003 and 4. Now we have this, the famous or infamous AKP Gülen coalition.
But by then, you said Gülen himself was skeptical until 2004. But we know by way of analysis that in 1990s, the Gülen movement had already started, launched its entry into certain segments of the state structures. And even in terms of police force, etc., the former Prime Minister Ecevit had approached and had some contacts and warm contacts with the Gülen movement, etc., etc. So it wasn't really that Gülen was totally skeptical, apparently.
Look, Yavuz, in the Turkish case, each Islamic organization is famous for, if I may say, a brand. Okay, for example, Adıyaman Group is famous for its investment in health. Iskender Pasha Erdogan Group is famous for politics. That's why Erdogan, it's not surprising to see Erdogan easily defeating Gülen movement. because Gülen movement doesn't believe in politics. So even it's a club of clever guys, political thought is very weak in Gülen movement. And we have, I quote, for example, Mahmut Sami Ramazanoğlu, who was an accountant. And then we have that Topbaş Cemaati, which is with many people with club of billionaires, okay? In the case of Gülen movement, the brand is focusing on bureaucracy. So, but it's not only about Gülen movement. For example, I don't want to give some names, but I know some names part of other movements who are university presidents in Turkey, ministers, bureaucrats, even intelligence, even Minister of Foreign Affairs. So this is nothing maybe wrong. This is Turkey. And I mean, if I was talking about the history of civil society in Germany, probably I will refer social democrats, civil unions. But this is the Turkish Ottoman cultural zone where we have Islamic groups. It's not European country. So it's normal to have that. The problem of Gülen movement is they are over represented, okay? And it's mainly thanks to AKP. I don't think Gülen movement...
It's overrepresented.
That's overrepresented, sorry. I don't think Gülen movement was such represented in... yes, of course, Gülen was already a powerful actor even late 90s, for example. But how it becomes such influential within state mechanism is no doubt it's Erdogan. I mean Erdogan. But the question is, historically speaking and philosophically speaking, because even from that regard, it is a philosophical question: how come Nurcu groups are supporting Erdogan? Because the theory they entertain is not compatible with Islamism. Okay, Islamism. So I wouldn't be surprised if Nurcu groups change their mind or Erdogan try to purge them if he needs to do so. So when it comes to Gülen movement, I think it's mainly in 2003 and 4, there was a change of idea among these groups. Normally, Erdogan and Gülen are famous because they don't like each other. And so it could be a kind of, let's say, an alliance to counterbalance Kemalism, or some, let's say, other actors in terms of their relations with the US. I don't know, I'm just speculating. But it must be, it's a question that we should think about that. And it's yet to be answered. We don't know the exact answer.
And to conclude, after the ousting, rather violently, of Gülen group from the state structure, how did Erdogan's Islamization project continue? What were they replaced with? And where does it bring us to?
Yeah, Erdogan is happy to employ Islamic organizations. It's still, as I told, as long as Islamic groups accept Erdogan as the leader, political leader, Erdogan keeps them in the game, giving some opportunities, state opportunities. I mean, some huge tenders, some construction companies, some offering lands. So this is in that sense, the logic of the game between state and Islamic groups is very simple. Erdogan is the leader to orchestrate those, and it gives a lot of opportunities. As I told, so many people are transferred from those groups to Minister of Education, to Minister of other ministries, and Director of Religious Affairs. So it's a kind of, let's say, cohabitation. But what is unique about Erdogan? We have a political actor who has the ability, or let's say capacity, for the first time in Turkey, who owns all other groups. Okay, so this is quite rare. I mean, and I should say that in this regard, is the first time Islamic groups lost their autonomy. I mean, of course, they always care about state, but this is too much. So they are de facto dominated by Erdogan's agenda.
I think, Gökhan, we should end here because this brings us to a very important topic of the role of Diyanet, its transformation. But we should leave it to our next talk because it is a chapter per se.
Yeah, it's a quite.
Maybe a small question to end it all is this sort of process or phenomenon that you describe, is it irreversible now as of 2021?
Well, I think we should accept the fact, as I told, Nakşibendi order is older than Turkish Republic. You turn off state at 5 p.m. in Turkey, they keep working. So Turkey shouldn't be naive imagining annihilating them, Turkey should find especially secular should think about that. And I'm sure, I'm not living in Turkey, but as far as I understand, CHP, they're trying on that.
CHP is the main opposition.
That's
Republic
right. So
people.
they should find a new political narrative or system that they're also safe, because we are talking about institutions which are older than centuries, okay? And these are transnational. So there are just let me remind you why Pope met Sistani Grand Ayatollah. This is the same case in Turkey.
Why?
So why Pope, the Pope met recently Grand Ayatollah Sistani. So this is exactly the case we have in Turkey. There are guys who lives in Turkey but influential in Caucasia because of their transnational impact. So the Turkish politics should be realistic and develop some new narratives and mechanisms to keep them in the game, but within a kind of secular system. It sounds very difficult, I know, but the alternative is the naive secular utopianism. Let's purge them. A Turkey without Tarika is not possible, historically speaking.
Old and new Turkey indeed. Thank you very much, Gökhan Bacık, for this conversation.
Bye-bye.